Magnus, can you hear us?
Well, I can hear you very clearly.
Great, great.
Good afternoon.
Uh, just a second. You cannot share your presentation? It says
Yeah,
still disabled?
it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah. Can you check now? Is it working?
Oh yeah, now it seems to be working.
Great, great. So, good afternoon to ones who are in Tashkent. Good morning to Magnus, who is now in Brighton, Sussex, in UK. So I would like briefly introduce Professor Magnus Marsden. So he conducted his PhD at University of Cambridge and defended it in 2002. Then he was for a period he was a research fellow at the Trinity College of University of Cambridge. In 2007, Magnus moved to SOAS, University of London, uh, and and he worked there until 2013 when he joined the University of Sussex as a professor of social anthropology. And now Magnus has several affiliations. He is a professor of School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex, director of Sussex Asia Center, vice president of the Association of International Afghan Studies, and at the same time, chief academic advisor of the Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies. So Magnus has extensive experience of conducting research on Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and today he will talk about his recent research on uh, Afghan merchants, how they developed, and he will, I assume you will question the existing narrative that Afghanistan is a periphery and
Hmm.
is actually one of the leading countries in building up trade links and connecting different parts of Eurasia. So we will have an introductory talk from Magnus for like about 40 minutes. Then we will have a question and answer session with all participants of our meeting. So today in this room we have uh, PhD students, undergrad students, and the staff members, research fellows from this University of World Economy Diplomas of School of International Relations. We have a chair of the Department of International Relations, Professor Ulugбек Hasanov, and also research fellows from the recently established institute, about which I told you a lot, Institute for Advanced International Studies. Thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yep.
We can have very well.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you, and also thanks to everybody for taking the time out of, I'm sure, your busy days to attend this, and also for the very warm and generous introduction. Yes, so today I'll talk about some of my recent work that was looking at Afghan merchants and trading networks involving people from Afghanistan. And it's been conducted over a decade, but the particular research I'm talking about today was conducted in the context of a grant from the European Union, the ERC, and that grant focused actually on a city in China called Yiwu, which is known as the world's center for the export of commodities of everyday use. But a consideration of that city brought my attention to the important role played by traders from Afghanistan in connecting different parts of Asia to one another. So over the past two decades then, projects of regional connectivity driven by state policy have come to be regarded as key, as we all know, to the future of Central Asia and to global economic growth more generally. This trope of the Silk Road has simultaneously grown in stature in scholarship on Asia. The concept has increasingly become used as a window into understanding global history and been deployed to reveal the state of geopolitical dynamics and tensions across what's often referred to as Eurasia. While the focus on mega projects of commerce and infrastructure is understandable, notably, of course, work on the Belt and Road Initiative, but before that on the US's Silk Road Initiative, the emphasis placed on these state-driven, state-centric and state-controlled visions of regional connectivity has silenced the ongoing significance of lived forms of Eurasian connections that predate mega projects. At the same time, the scholarship, which is fixated on the local versus the global often, has resulted in comparatively little attention being paid to historically durable expressions of trans-regional connectivity. Connectivity, in other words, between adjacent regions, Central Asia and South Asia, for example. The vantage point that I'm going to take in this presentation on contemporary iterations of the Silk Road then is not that of Chinese policymakers, but rather of traders from Afghanistan, which, as we all know, is one of the world's more turbulent countries. In the presentation, I'm going to identify and analyze two major corridors of Afghan trade and mobility. One that connects post-Soviet Eurasia to China via the Muslim majority republics of Central Asia, and the other that binds Turkey, the Arabian Peninsula, and Central Asia in a triangle. Afghan merchants, then, I'm going to show, simultaneously connect West Asia, Central Asia to East Asia, and its southern, and also Turkey to Central Asia. And I conducted fieldwork with traders in Afghanistan, Kabul, for example, but also in the vibrant commercial nodes in which traders from the country operate. I spent time with traders from Afghanistan then in their shops in Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif and Herat, as well as offices in China's international trade city, Yiwu, as well as in wholesale markets in West Asia, for example, in Jeddah, Dubai, and Istanbul, and what we often refer to as Eurasia, Odessa, in Moscow, and St. Petersburg. Describing and analyzing the experience of mobile traders, the networks they form, and the multiple inter-Asian commercial nodes in which they operate, illuminates the vitality of their commercial activities, histories, communities, and geographies. Before turning then to this empirical material, I will first explore the notion of geopolitics and historical processes and the importance of these to the analysis of Afghan trading networks. So first, let me say some brief words about how I think of geopolitics in relationship to my research. So the focus of my research has been then on types of networks and communities that are important to informal Eurasian traders, as well as the routes along which goods, people, and ideas travel. In order to understand these aspects of the traders' lives, however, there is a need to consider the broader geopolitical context of the settings in which they act, and to ask how geopolitical dynamics inform and are informed by the traders' personal and collective identities and strategies. Scholarship tends to distinguish between forms of economic globalization forged from the bottom up and those orchestrated top down by nation states and international organizations. International boundary crossing mobility is a central aspect of the traders' livelihoods. As a result, the traders with whom I have worked are routinely exposed to and sensitive of geopolitical shifts. I emphasize how in order to participate in commercial forms of connective activity, merchants must learn to navigate multiple projects of geopolitical engineering and the forms of political and cultural divergence these inevitably spawn. The traders, I argue, are adept at contending with geopolitical tensions through the conduct of what can be referred to as informal or everyday diplomacy, the concept that I know colleagues in Uzbekistan have contributed greatly to the study of. They also build institutions that are the product of and able to withstand shifts in geopolitical configuration through time. In the course of these activities, the traders forge transnational routes and nodes of circulation which channel significant flows of people, resources, and ideas. The routes and nodes authored by the traders are of interest to state actors who react to them in a range of ways, attempting to regulate them, capitalizing directly from them, and using them as channels to extend the influence and reach of the states for which they serve across national boundaries. Given the interconnected relationship between the activities of traders and the geopolitical processes that affect their lives, I then seek to develop an anthropological approach to the study of geopolitics as lived, and suggest the significance of this for understanding contemporary iterations of the Silk Road. My approach to this issue then departs from the conventional tendency to assume that the sphere of geopolitics is the preserve of state actors alone and inherently external to society, impinging upon everyday life, but not being shaped by it. The traders on whom I have focused do not merely carry out the same role as state actors, diplomats and strategists in the commercial rather than the political sphere, or in an informal rather than formal idiom. Nor is it the paucity of the resources available to traders as compared to states that distinguishes the role they play in geopolitical processes. An anthropological approach to lived geopolitics rather resists locating groups such as the traders I introduced today as being either above or below the state, and it focuses rather on recognizing that the context in which they act is located in the interstices between geopolitical projects, including those distributed across time, for example, as in the shift in forms of Eurasian connectivity promoted by the USSR to those developed by China, and across space, for instance, between Russian and Turkish conceptions of Eurasian connectivity. It is helpful to think of Afghan mobile traders in terms, it's unhelpful, sorry, to think of Afghan mobile traders in terms of their being either opposed to state boundaries and geopolitical projects or simply derivative of them. The traders rather are themselves authors of geopolitical routes, connections, and imaginations, and this distinguishes them from business communities originating in nation states that are themselves active in promoting projects of Eurasian connectivity. Unlike political projects, moreover, such as ISIS, the transregional routes and geographical imaginations the traders author are imbricated and layered in a complex and inherently contingent way with official geopolitics. An analysis of their activities thus requires a consideration of specific geopolitical contexts across both space and time. Having talked briefly about the role of the concept of geopolitics in this research, and I want to just reflect briefly on the importance of history to the analysis of these networks as well. And a key finding of the research upon which I report today is that commercial networks made up of individual traders play a critical role in connecting different parts of Asia to one another. Several excellent work by historians have gone beyond abstract and aggregate models of the so-called Silk Road, and instead they've developed a Eurasian geopolitical frame that brings together regions, Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, that have tended to be treated in the classical literature, at least, as distinct, quote-unquote, civilizations. This approach emphasizes the interlinked and entangled histories of Eurasia, while recognizing that encounters and interactions often lead to disconnections and constructions of difference as much as they do to some fluid and flat world of cultural interaction. Historians such as Laleh Chan have presented fine-grained pictures of the people, places, contradictions, and experiences that inform the makeup of specific networks which played a critical role in facilitating commercial, cultural, and intellectual exchanges in modern Eurasia. Laleh Chan's work, of course, exploring the importance of traders from Central Asia in the Ottoman world. These studies have emphasized the role played by ties of trust and commercial institutions in facilitating the operations and durability of long-distance trading networks. Such studies often dwell on the powerful mechanisms developed and deployed by networks collectively to enforce shared standards of behavior across long distances. They emphasize the strategies and cultural forms developed by traders to communicate in complex, multilingual, and multicultural worlds. The role played by shared commitments to religion and ethnicity have played a prominent role in the analysis of the internal coherence of networks and their ability to withstand historical change over centuries. Of importance too in such literature has been the recognition of lingua francas, notably Persian, that are readily deployed by traders and other mobile people, regardless of their specific cultural, religious, and regional identities and backgrounds. New approaches to the Eurasian arena developed by historians do not treat the region as a sort of unitary civilization then. Eurasia, they show, rather, is helpfully conceptualized as a crossroads of imperial, economic, and cultural interactions that resulted both in significant connections and commonalities, but also, of course, powerful disconnections and divergences. There are, I think, striking similarities between the networks that I'm going to talk about later and those documented by historians. These similarities are visible in terms of the importance of understandings of trust to the traders' own analyses of the functioning of the networks to which they belong. They are also apparent in terms of the ways in which networks both cross vast territories and are made up of mobile individuals, yet simultaneously also depend on their ability to anchor their commercial activities into specific nodes. In a manner reminiscent of Christopher Bailey, the late historian's analysis of colonial India's information order, if networks enable the circulation of critical commercial and political information across long distances, then the nodes at which traders coalesce function as pools for the sharing of information and knowledge about opportunities and risks. Nodes are also the sites in which the reputations of individual commercial personnel are made and unmade. Nodes also produce the conditions in which networks reproduce themselves culturally, ideologically, and sociologically, acting as emotionally pregnant spaces in which traders cultivate and embody shared sensibilities, establish families, and reproduce community life. Finally, the networks that operate across Eurasian contexts today, like those from the deeper past, are historically layered. The contemporary shape of networks reflect both modern geopolitical projects, but also the ongoing significance of past geopolitical and commercial arrangements. The networks thus layer together, paper over, and mediate between multiple projects of Eurasian connectivity across both space and time. Rather than approaching history then as a series of unfolding stages, understanding the influence of Eurasian projects of connectivity on trading networks requires an approach towards time that is layered, overlapping, and interpenetrating, and a concurrent conceptualization of the network's relationship to space that emphasizes circulatory mobility rather than one which assumes that networks are transnational, in other words, just connecting different nation states. In short, the extensions in space of particular nation states. Traders working in the markets of Eurasia today are not the archaic hangovers of earlier forms of economic activity. Rather, studying them reveals the ways in which multiple histories are interleaved in an overlapping way in the trading networks that they form. And the diversity arising from such historical processes manifests itself importantly in the ability of traders to be flexible in the face of geopolitical change and transformation. And it's this diversity, and this diversity achieves the status as a valued resource for the traders because it allows them to respond to changing scenarios. So having introduced the importance of geopolitical context and history to the understanding of trading networks, I'll now turn to look at the two networks that I focused on in particular. And the first one is what I refer to as the Eurasian network. And a regional context in which traders from Afghanistan have demonstrated themselves as being especially adept operators are the context across the former Soviet Union and what I refer to as the Eurasian context. Here is a very important market, and it continues to be an important market for traders in this context, Odessa on the Black Sea. And this map shows some of the key sites of importance for traders working in what I refer to as this Eurasian context. Now, of course, historically, over the past 20 years, the depiction of traders from Afghanistan across this space and then also Central Asia has shifted. Occasionally, they've been depicted as problematic in terms of their activity in various forms of illegal trade, and at other times they've been regarded as important sources for resource and also trading skills. But what is the history of the presence of Afghan traders in these contexts? Afghan commercial networks in post-Soviet context were established largely by Soviet sympathizing Afghans who studied in Soviet universities, technical institutes, and party schools, in particular during the 70s and 80s. Now, as well as studying, students from Afghanistan, as you probably know, also engaged in petty trade on the side of their education. Some of them dealt in foreign currency, whilst others clandestinely sold Indian-made cloth and jeans that they brought to Soviet contexts from Afghanistan and that had got to Afghanistan from Hong Kong. When they returned to Afghanistan during their summer holidays, they transported air conditioning units that had been made in Azerbaijan and Russian-made teapots. And this sort of trade, informal and small-scale trade, was extended regionally. So goods such as these found their way to Pakistan, for instance, along established smuggling networks crossing the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The trading activities of these Afghan students built on a deep knowledge of the historical trade in Muslim Central Asia and Eurasia. Various Afghan networks, including those particularly made up of non-Muslims from Afghanistan, Sikhs and Hindus in particular, but also traders of Jewish origin, had been active in the trade between British India and Central Asia and the Russian Empire. And indeed, Hindu trading networks in the 19th century stretched right up to Murmansk. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Afghan traders played a role in ensuring that the populations of the Soviet Union's successor states were able to procure the basic stuff of daily consumption, including food. Afghans exported to Central Asia foodstuffs, for example, manufactured in Iran and Pakistan. And in the same years, they also played a significant role in opening the wholesale market in Chinese commodities in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. To do so, they played a role, they had to establish trade routes between China and the post-Soviet states, interacting with officials and negotiating market access with other influential trading communities. especially Azerbaijanis and other commercially active and politically influential groups at the time from the Caucasus. So I've often spoken to traders who are now in their 60s, who initially began doing business between Beijing and Kiev, for example, in the early 1990s, and at that point they would travel to Beijing and actually bring the goods back to the former Soviet Union themselves, traveling with the goods overland. Afghans also moved. Afghans also then, however, moved to the former Soviet context after the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. And in this context, many registered themselves as refugees. Some found informal employment in the region's container markets, such as that in Odessa and these in Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg, and where they worked as sellers for the established Afghan merchants who had been in these settings for longer. Others, however, were able to, especially in later years, bring US dollars that they'd earned working for foreign armies and doing business in Afghanistan, and they were able to establish partnerships with people with more settled Afghans. Such activities continue to be important to the region's economy today, although the picture is varied, with some settings having introduced legislation to curtail the scope of Afghan businesses and others having encouraged it. After the Eurasian Customs Union was launched in 2015, Afghans also increasingly shipped goods to Russia and Belarus using Kazakhstan, for example, port and rail network, and also diversified their range of activities, supplying raw materials, for example, such as Russian wood pulp to Afghanistan, and exporting goods, for example, Moldovan wine and Ukrainian sunflower oil to China. And in the current situation, this range of activities is getting even broader, with more types of exports from the region being facilitated by Afghan traders. For such networks to function, merchants cultivate and sustain close relationships with regional officials. It's these relationships that help to insulate traders at times of political sensitivity. As one trader remarked to me in Yiwu in China in January 2018, "We Afghans have lots of experience of states grabbing our money. That's why the only people who invest in China are those who know officials in high places who are ready to inform them of new policies coming our way." Afghan merchants operating in this expansive context communicate with one another in Persian or Farsi and Pashto, but they're also always fluent in Turkic and Persian languages, as well as Russian and often also Mandarin or Cantonese. Pointing to such skills, they refer to themselves as diplomats. Their cultural and linguistic versatility and skills in what I refer to as informal diplomacy are also occasionally latched upon by the authorities in the countries in which they work. A trader from Afghanistan and Ukraine was said, for example, to have helped secure the release of Ukrainian citizens captured by the Taliban about a decade earlier. Whereas in China, a trader from Afghanistan in the city of Yiwu was elected as representatives of the city's 13,000 or so foreign traders, and is now a regular feature of official meetings organized by the city's municipal government. At the same time, states have also recognized the geopolitical potentials of working with this group of savvy traders. And a particularly notable example of this is the role played by Afghan organizations in Russia in terms of organizing early discussions between Afghan actors and the Taliban. Many of these discussions were organized by the Russian state, although the state presented the key organizations that facilitated such events as being Afghan diaspora organizations, which shows the level of the connection and interaction between the diaspora organizations and the Russian state, and a sort of mutual trust, in a sense, between them. Islam is an important aspect of the organizational activities of Afghans in Eurasia, but the role it plays in the networks is contested and variable rather than monolithic and simple. And this is significant given the analytical weight often invested by scholars of the New Silk Road on Islam's significance to the coherence of trading networks. The contested significance of Islam in the dynamics of Afghan trading networks in post-Soviet Eurasia reminds us of the dangers of assuming that mobile Muslims inevitably express commitment to some type of global Islam. Indeed, Afghan traders regularly distance themselves from global Islam in a conscious manner, and they regard doing so as being central to their ability to navigate between competing projects of global Eurasian connectivity. So Afghans working in formerly Soviet Eurasian contexts today do regularly emphasize, their Muslim identity and nature. They say that they've become a lot more religious and observant Muslims in the years following 1991. They say that fewer of their compatriots drink alcohol in the past, for instance, and they've also played an active role in establishing mosques and prayer rooms in cities such as Odessa and elsewhere. But at the same time, the social institutions established by Afghans in cities such as Odessa in Ukraine are not Islamic in any simple sense. One well-known trader in the city of Odessa, for example, from northern Afghanistan, who I know, used a considerable sum of his own money to purchase land close to the market, on which he built a large structure, ostensibly at least for the benefit of the community. The concrete structure houses a large mosque on the ground floor, and an airy hall is decorated with wall paintings of important figures and landmarks from Afghan history on the second floor, whilst on the third floor there is a hotel with rooms for guests. As one trader in his late 40s who lives in Odessa remarked to me wilily, people couldn't work out whether the building that he constructed was a mosque or whether in fact it was a discotheque. In other words, that there's a great flexibility in terms of how these institutions are used. So now let me briefly summarize the arguments made thus far concerning the Eurasian corridor of connectivity and the role of Afghan traders within it. First, I've emphasized the prominent and visible role played by traders of Afghan background in Eurasian settings, illustrated that the history of these networks lies in Cold War geopolitical dynamics. And I've also shown how traders have successfully negotiated the new geopolitical predicaments, both of Afghanistan and of the countries in which they live and work. Secondly, I've also emphasized the importance of institutions built by the traders to their collective activities, especially in terms of mediating their relationships with state officials, as well as their significant importance in these settings to building shared sensibility and intense forms of familiarity within networks. And third, a distinct but related finding concerns the extent to which such institutions in these Eurasian contexts are regularly defined in terms of the shared national background of Afghans. And it's on this basis states in Eurasia interact and engage with them. Religion plays a powerful and important role in traders' daily lives and self-identities. But religious institutions tend to play a dual role, both in terms of fostering distinctly Afghan cultural sensibilities, knowledge, and identifications, as well as acting as a site of religious ritual and worship. And so to a large extent then in the Eurasian corridor, Afghan identity is built and performed in relationship to a national identity that's often in competition with sort of more religious identity formations. So having talked about the Eurasian context now, I want to move on to look at the second example, second sort of key corridor of connectivity, which is the Afghans in West Asia. And this second key human commercial corridor brings to light the activity of traders who are originally from Afghanistan and Central Asia's border regions. But they currently live and work in some of the key hubs of West Asia, religious, commercial and political centers such as Istanbul and Jeddah. Transnational communities and networks of these Afghan Central Asians are playing an important role in creating trans-regional connectivity across multiple West Asian contexts. And they also link, as I'm going to show, these context settings in East Asia. Now, many of the traders in this corridor claim descent from families who lived in the Emirates and Khanates of Central Asia until they emigrated across the border to Afghanistan in the 1920s and 1930s against the backdrop of the Bolshevik Revolution. And as for many Afghans, or people from Afghanistan, the concept of Afghan is complicated for these people. Most of them do, at some level, refer to themselves as Afghan, but they also have parallel concepts of identity, such as some refer to themselves, for instance, as being Bukharan or Bukhari or Ferghanachi, identity categories, as you know, relating to their backgrounds in Central Asia. These Bukharan emigre families then lived in northern Afghanistan until the 1980s. Between the 1920s, and this is some of the sites in which they live in northern Afghanistan. Between the 1920s and 70s, they were active in Afghanistan's industrial and commercial sectors, especially in the fur, curricle, and carpet business. And they played a leading role also, the wealthier families, in the development of modern industry in Afghanistan. Elite Central Asian families in Afghanistan enjoyed close ties to Afghanistan's urban elite and achieved high-level positions in government. And some of these elite Bukharan Central Asian families began to leave Afghanistan for Saudi Arabia, Europe, and the United States after the 1973 coup d'etat, which resulted in the overthrow of Afghanistan's monarchy. And at that point, some saw sort of a future of instability for Afghanistan and decided to leave the country. After the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union in '79, less wealthy emigre families often moved to Pakistan, fearing that their lands and capital would be confiscated by the, at the time, hardline communist regime in Kabul. Community elders supported various anti-Soviet Mujahideen organizations, but many migrated so that their children could evade conscription both by the Mujahideen and also the Soviet army. In Pakistan, they continued to be active in the Central Asian carpet manufacture and trading industry. And in the late 1980s, hundreds of these families moved from Pakistan to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, which is pictured here. And Central Asians had lived, of course, in the Bukharia neighborhood of Jeddah since at least the 1850s, where they acted as pilgrimage guides. And these historic communities were then joined by later flows of Central Asians in the 1920s, but then again, those coming from Afghanistan and Pakistan, in particular in the 1980s. The Central Asians emigres, Afghan emigres who arrived in Jeddah in the 80s, rapidly established themselves in the city as well as in Mecca and Medina. Initially, they filled niches in the economy that had been vacated by earlier waves of migrants from Central Asia, most especially the restaurants selling the popular Saudi dish, Ruz al-Bukhari, or Bukhari rice. They then became active in the import from Turkey and subsequently China of machine-made prayer carpets and cheap ready-made clothing, both items that had a good sales in Saudi Arabia because they were bought both by Hajis who were visiting Saudi, but also the overseas laborers who took such things back as gifts to their home countries, especially in South Asia. And Saudi Arabia, obviously, to live is complicated. There's something called the kafala system, whereby foreign businesses must be registered in the name of a Saudi sponsor or kafil. And this makes owning businesses in Saudi inherently risky for foreigners, the ajnabi. And as a result, some successful merchants in Saudi Arabia moved their capital to Turkey and bought homes initially in Istanbul's Zeytinburnu neighborhood, but now more broadly in other places like Beylikdüzü and elsewhere. And these had also been sites of Central Asian community life in Turkey from the mid-20th century onwards. And in more recent times, the merchants of this background have invested in new developments that have sprung up under the recent Turkish regimes. And in addition, poorer families also increasingly began to leave Saudi Arabia if they could, because of rising expenses, in particular driven by the family tax that was introduced in Saudi Arabia in 2016, and a greater degree of attempts to Saudiize the economy. Now, the institutional life of Central Asia's emigres also plays a major role in facilitating the ability of individuals and families to secure access to citizenship and residency in Turkey. So these Central Asian emigre Afghans established associations that present their relationships most conventionally in terms of the category Afghan Turk. And Turkey, of course, has for long had close relationships with Afghanistan's Turkic-speaking communities. Several thousand Afghans in the 1980s were resettled in southeastern Turkey on the basis of there being Uzbek and Kyrgyz-speaking Turks. And more recently, of course, Turkey's foreign policy in the so-called pivot to the east has also resulted in Afghanistan's Central Asian emigres aligning themselves with this sort of reinvented Ottoman identity. And the associations that Afghans form in Turkey, I've often been told, play an important role in mediating the citizenship and residence applications of Afghans in the country. Now, these Afghan traders in West Asia are similar to those in Eurasia, culturally and linguistically versatile. They're at home across the Muslim societies of South and Central Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, as well as Turkey. They speak Arabic, Persian, Central Asian, Turkic languages, and modern Turkish. And those who travel for trade to China often also speak Mandarin and Cantonese. And many, because of their life in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, are fluent in Urdu. But there are also important some differences between this group and the others. The emigre traders in West Asia often remark that their people chose to live in Saudi Arabia because there are fewer greater blessings than living close to the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina. And they also say that they're most content in countries where they can hear the call to prayer. And one of the interesting things about this community is the focus increasingly of Istanbul as a site of community life, and many choosing to move their parents and elderly relatives to live in Istanbul because it's seen as a sort of authentic place for them to live and in which to foster their collective identities. So across both the Eurasian and West Asian corridors of connectivity, then cultural and linguistic versatility are valued, and newer geographies and communities of trade overlay multiple layers of past commercial activity. But there are also differences in the dynamics and history of the two corridors. By contrast to the secularism of Afghan traders in Eurasia, merchants operating in the West Asian corridor fashion identities that transgress the boundaries of the nation state and emphasize the significance and centrality of Islam. So to briefly conclude then, I've suggested then that we have these two axes of mobility that are disconnected and characterized by contrasting cultural and political outlooks and priorities. But what's the future of these networks and the forms of connectivity in which they have played such a critical role? I think it might be tempting to argue that the trading structures that are either imbued with the capacity to endure over time, or that mega projects are going to question the capacity of apparently traditional modes of inter-Asian commerce to persist. I've sought in this talk to question these assumptions. On the one hand, as William Van Schendel has recently argued, states see less and their knowledge is less precise than they pretend. As a result, state-centric initiatives, including the Belt and Road, will probably suffer the same legibility deficits that provide the scope for informality that other recent multi-state programs such as the War on Terror and the War on Drugs have suffered from. On the other hand, trading networks and the corridors along which they operate are not given durable or geographically stable structures. They are rather heterogeneous and shifting structures that are engaged in a multiplicity of activities at any one time. Successful traders are durable. Successful networks are durable amidst such flux and uncertainty. Exploring networks from the inside out challenges assumptions that trust arising from coherent identity or ethics is the touchstone of durable trading networks. The networks that I've introduced today take active steps to ensure rather that they have access to a wide and varied pool of cultural and ideological resources. Those making up trading networks seek to create and inhabit institutions that enable and regulate connections between nodes. They understand broader geopolitical processes and adapt to these in ways that enable them to mediate between different political moments and emerging geopolitical geographies. The future of such networks then is entwined with unfolding forms of Eurasian geopolitics. The traders I've introduced today are capable of mediating between competing geopolitics. It's unlikely that one or other of these projects will dominate Eurasia. Indeed, the rise of smaller states as geopolitical players suggests, if anything, a growing degree of diversity and complexity. Networks of a variety of types that fulfill a range of functions will continue to play a vital role in the making of actually existing forms of Eurasian connectivity in the years to come. The structure of these networks will take the nature of their shared goals, identities, and collective ambitions. Their ideological, ethical, and cultural content, as well as the geographical distributions of their nodes, however, will be contingent upon the outcome of ongoing geopolitical processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Magnus, for excellent grand picture of how Afghan traders actually developed Eurasian connectivity and trade links. And despite leaving their home country and being located in different parts of Eurasia, kept ties with their home country, but also stimulated the further expansion of trade links and all the connectivity issues with the rest of Eurasia. So I think let's now open floor for questions and comments. Who would like to ask a question? Yes, please. Please introduce briefly.
Good afternoon, Mr. Magnus. I'm the student of the University of World Economy and Diplomacy. I'm studying the faculty of the International Relations. So my question is related to the the geopolitics of Afghanistan. So my question is that what kind of outcomes can we expect if Afghanistan achieves this kind of connectivity? Is that possible? Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the role of this, the relationship between these types of connectivity and the internal dynamics of Afghanistan are very important. I suppose we can think of it in two ways. On the one hand, these types of connectivity, they had become regarded, I think, by some politicians and state actors in Afghanistan as a sort of potential avenue for Afghanistan to enhance its sort of what we often refer to as soft diplomacy, to show that the links and the versatility of traders from Afghanistan facilitated a sort of a different perspective of Afghanistan and a different nature of its relationship with the world, and that there was a movement to think of this type of connections within that frame politically over the past 20 years. But on the other hand, there's also all of the sort of more negative or the more problematic aspects of such connectivity. You know, both within Afghanistan in terms of traders and mobile people as being seen as the potential insidious carriers of outside ideas, and that type of notion may be more important now perhaps than in the past period, but also by external actors who often see such trading networks and such forms of connectivity through the narrow lens of these people as being, you know, sort of illegal, as sources of disorder in the region, either in terms of the commodities that they deal in or in terms of the ideas that they hold. So I think it's this this balance between these connections as having this sort of potentially positive aspect for the representation and for the activities of Afghanistan in a wider region, but then the extent to which both internally and externally they're often deployed in a sort of more negative and problematic light. And I think, as I've said, there was a trend for the more positive aspect of them to be developed, but I don't know, I'm not sure to what extent that will be continued to be developed, or whether it'll become more sort of problematically in the current context.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have another question.
Good afternoon, Mr. Magnus. I'm a student, a third year student at the Faculty of International Relations. My name is Oedbek, and first of all, it's great honor to have you making some conversation with you. I really appreciate it. And my question is, the regions of Afghanistan, as you mentioned, what kind of trade stability you are waiting, and how can you remark this? Thanks for your answer.
What kind of trade stability?
Stability, yeah.
I mean, in terms of the stability of the trade, I think that a sort of improved security within Afghanistan and a clearer sort of set of parameters of the role of the Afghan state in monitoring and overseeing and taxing trade have the potential of increasing levels of stability of Afghanistan as a potential, site, for example, as a corridor between Central and South Asia. So all of those things are there, and people do report now, traders at least, on greater stability of Afghanistan as a trading hub, as a route or a trading route. But on the other hand, the success of many of these trading networks are actually reflect the ability of traders to deal with instability. And so for the external networks, it's the ability of people to trade in places that others can't, to deal with unstable political, economic contexts in ways that other groups can't, that actually gives a boost to these networks. And that's why, it's interesting in terms of the wider region, that instability in Ukraine produces, another context, for instance, produces actually quite new and different opportunities for traders from this background. So I think one can imagine a situation in which there is a possibility of a sort of greater stability, I think, of Afghanistan itself as a transit corridor, but also of the networks and the wider activities as being continuing to interact with them, adapt to instability in the wider region. So there's both an internal and an external aspect to this instability.
Thank you very much. So, any other questions? I have one question. So, after the Taliban takeover and this new wave of migration from Afghanistan, a huge number of people were relocated to different parts of Eurasia and other parts of the world. Do you see any changes in this trade links in in locations, or maybe emergence of new locations of these trade merchants and their activities?
Mm. It's a very good point, and I've been trying to sort of look into this issue. At the moment, I don't particularly, at least not so far. That's because many of the people who moved were not necessarily part of these type of trading networks. Many of the people who left Afghanistan over the past 18 months, were those who had worked for the state, government officials, NGOs, media, and also high-level politicians, who are sort of slightly disconnected from these more informal trading groups and networks that I've talked about. But what I and they'd also, they were advancing when they were involved in the economic life of Afghanistan in major ways, but in particular, in the sort of more classical neoliberal activities, security companies, the new types of consultants companies, interaction between the US and military and, for example, contractors. So it was that type of activity that they're involved in, less the commodity trade that I've talked about. So I think they might well be influential in forging those new types of economic activity, but less in these particular networks. But what I do see is the ways in which Afghan traders involved in the networks I've studied have now responded to the movement of these new communities of often quite wealthy Afghans. So Turkey, for instance, there was a famous hotel and restaurant and business chain in China that suffered majorly from the COVID pandemic and the restriction of traveling back and forth between China. And they've recently invested in new branches in Istanbul and Turkey, Turkey and Istanbul in particular, providing basically new services for these new large Afghan communities in Turkey, in terms of both offering trade and transport services, but also, sites of community interaction, wedding halls, and so on and so forth. So I do think that what we'll see is the networks adapting and seeking new sites of investment in the context of those movements out of Afghanistan. But at the moment, what I see is more consolidation of the actual networks and their locations rather than new settings. So we see, again, the growing importance of Istanbul, an ongoing importance of Dubai, as declining significance of Saudi because it's just so much harder to work there now, and also the focus on Saudiization. Russia continues to be important, and of course now traders are able to bring goods from China easily to Russia, and also to move currency easily between Russia and elsewhere. We're in actually quite a strong position in Russia. Even Ukraine, a lot of traders from Afghanistan left Ukraine, many I knew, last March, but over the summer and even now more have returned there, having, for example, put their families somewhere else in Europe. They've returned to Ukraine because there are quite big, as is often the case in war zones, quite a big commercial opportunities, things like electrical goods, handheld torches. So traders from Afghanistan apparently doing a lively business now in Ukraine and returning. So in a sense, there's this sort of consolidation of anything of the hubs in which I've worked, and I haven't really heard a great deal about new locations. So I think the geographies of this occasion have proved quite resilient, but of course they'll change over time.
Yeah, thank you very much. You have a question? Yeah, please. We have a visiting professor from South Korea, Mr. Cho Ham Lee. He would like to ask a question.
Thank you, Rector, Mr. Magnus, Marsden. I'm visiting scholar from South Korea. I have one question. I heard about the importance of connectivity and solidarity in Central Asia. So, with the growing geopolitical importance of Eurasia, I think that the Russian and the Chinese variables may cause one division depending on each country's interest.
Mm.
So what role do you think Uzbekistan should play most urgently to strengthen its connectivity to Central Asia? What role Uzbekistan have to importance role?
It's an interesting question. It's sort of slightly beyond my sphere of expertise in sort of the role of Uzbekistan particularly, but of course Uzbekistan's central really to the connectivities of different parts of Central Asia geographically, but also in terms of economically, and also because it's such an important connective point between Central Asia and South Asia via Afghanistan and indeed to West Asia as well. So one would have thought that it's by continuing its activities in terms of promoting and recognizing the value of greater Central Asian connectivities, that would be very much in the interests of Uzbekistan.
Okay, thank you. Are there any comments from our online participants? I think you delivered us very comprehensive lecture about how these Afghan traders are playing vital role in keeping connectivity and trade relations in Eurasia, and how their distribution across Eurasia actually helped us to sustain in the periods of crises and to keep our relationship. And thank you very much for this excellent meeting. I hope we will continue our partnership, and we are very grateful for your time, for your commitment. We discussed this meeting several times with Magnus, and finally we could manage to conduct it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope very much to see you in Tashkent again soon.
Yeah, exactly. We hope we will have another meeting next time, in person one. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.